at the end of the Soviet Union, the average person woke up in the wrong city, went to work in the wrong job, doing the wrong thing, and they'd done it for decades.
Yeah.
So that's like all they know. So of course, in that system, if you're going to try to actually build things consumers are going to voluntarily willing to purchase, there's a lot of pain that has to go on. If all you know how to do is...
Hello. Welcome again to the episode in the Let People Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Today, I'm delighted to have on a second-time guest. He's only the second person that's done this now, a two-time guest now, and it's Dr. Matt Mitchell. Matt, welcome to Let People Prosper show.
Thank you so much. I'm honored. That's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, it is, and I'm excited to talk to you. You've got this great series going on about Estonia and Poland and some other things about free markets, and so it's really amazing, and I'm glad to have you back on the program to talk about it. Before we get going, though, we got a lot to talk about. For the audience, let me go ahead and read your bio, and then we can dig in. So, Dr. Matt Mitchell is a senior fellow in the Center for Economic Freedom at the Fraser Institute. Prior to joining the Fraser Institute, he was a long-serving senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where he remains an affiliated senior scholar. He is also a senior research fellow at the NE Regulatory Research Center at West Virginia University. Mitchell received his PhD and MA in economics from George Mason University and his BA in political science and BS in economics from Arizona State University. So, with all that now, Matt, and we've kind of went over a little, why do you motivated to do what you do every day in the first episode, which I'll put in the show notes, link at vanceginn.substack.com. But what I thought maybe would be good here is to say, what motivates you to really get into this whole idea of what's happened in Poland and Estonia and other places? Why do you do this?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple reasons. I think last time we talked quite a bit about our survey that we had done of young people and their perceptions that socialism would be a better system. And I think that is important, especially when you consider the fact that, about half the people in the United States alive today have no working memory of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I think there's another aspect here, and it has to do a little bit with the way humans process ideas. I'm work at the Center for Economic Freedom, and we've just unfortunately seen the passing of Jim Gortney, a giant among economists who pioneered work in trying to measure economic freedom. And, that work to me has always been extremely influential, and I think a very powerful way to understand the way the world works. You got 165 countries, data from each of these countries dating back, decades, and now it's been the subject of over 1,300 peer-reviewed academic studies assessing the effect of economic freedom on human well-being. Now, to me, that's those are extremely compelling statistics. So you've got huge data sets, right? You've got lots of different ways to measure them. You've got, clever statistical techniques that try to get at causal inferences and things like that. But I have to admit, for a normal person, a normie, that kind of argument is sometimes not as compelling as just digging in and telling a story. And so that's what I think the opportunity to understand Estonia or understand Poland really brings out, is that you can roll up your sleeves and zoom in on one, it's an N of one, it's one country, but it's still nevertheless important data that you can draw out of that story, understand the effect of socialism on a people, and then understand the effect of liberation on a people. And, when you get down to it, the Estonian people and the Estonian culture and their history, it's really absolutely fascinating. So that just made it all the more rewarding to dig into it.
Yeah, no, that's great, Matt. And I think one of the things we talked about last time is the institutional framework that allows for people to prosper. And I know that's been a lot of your work over time, and you've worked on a lot of issues. I mean, we've been in touch for a number of years now, and it's kind of been interesting to see your career and how you've been working on these different areas. And I think that it all comes nice to fruition to this place where you're at today, to say, let's take these institutional frameworks in these different areas and see how they work in places that had almost a natural experiment that we don't get too often in economics, of a major change and shift in places like Poland and Estonia, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I can't remember if we talked about this with Poland, but one of the things that's interesting about it is that Marxism and Marxist-Leninism styled itself as a scientific type of socialism, and they were really trying to draw a distinction between themselves and the previous socialists whom they criticized as utopian socialists. Brian Kaplan has an interesting piece on this a few months ago, in which he points out, in many ways, actually, the utopian socialists were far more scientific than the so-called scientific socialists, because the utopians at least tried to, do an experiment. They would, do these experiments in North America with these communes and try to tweak and figure out what happened. Marx, on the other hand, believed that he had a better understanding of the way the world works and the advancement of, different epochs of human society, where you have feudalism, and then feudalism leads to capitalism, and then capitalism leads to socialism, and socialism leads to communism, where the state withers away. Like, he had this idea that he just understood the way it all worked, didn't really test it. Now, Lenin and Stalin come along, and they actually put it to the test, and we have a third of the planet subjected to socialism for half a century. So now, if you're among those 50% of people who thinks that socialism might be a good system, I think it behooves you to look and see what that experiment actually produced. And that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And there's also a great website that goes along with this, realitysofsocialism.org/Estonia. You can go and check that out. There's the publication, there's videos, there's a lot of great information, not only for hopefully my audience to go in and check that out, but I also think for teaching, for educating, for kids and others that are out there, I think this is a great way to see the costs and also what reform can do when you get more towards capitalism and everything else. And so let's dig in a little bit more with Estonia, though, kind of like we did with Poland. If you're telling the story of Estonia, where do you like to start? How do we get going when we're thinking about what's happened in Estonia?
Yeah. I mean, first, I kind of feel like I have to orient people to what this country is. It is a small country. At its largest, it's only about 1 million people. And where it's situated is right on the eastern edge of Europe, or you could put it as the western edge of Asia. And in some ways, it's, in Huntington's famous terminology, it's really where cultures clash. So it's it's at a literal crossroads, right at a north-south and east-west trade routes. Its major cities had been part of the Hanseatic League. Its people are some of the oldest ethnic people in all of Europe, and yet it's a really young country. So I like to say that it's a very old people in a young country. So they really didn't start to see themselves as a country until the mid part of the 19th century. They have their own culture, they have their own language. It's part of the Finno-Ugric language group. They have this sort of affinity with Scandinavia. They had a history of being, involved in piracy or in the Viking lifestyle. Over the history had been invaded, from all directions, east, west, north, south, you name it. The Germans, the Scandinavians, the Poles, and the Russians, they had all invaded them. But by the middle of the 19th century, they were in the Russian hands. And it was at this point, under Tsarist Russia, that they began to start to develop themselves, the idea that they were their own nation. And this isn't just something that happens spontaneously. This is something where there's actually cultural entrepreneurs out there making this happen. People who were starting schools, people who were encouraging cultural expression, people who were nurturing what was really already an important part of Estonia, which was its cultural tradition of singing. So they'd get together often in the summer in the forest around campfires, and they'd sing in this call and response fashion. And they'd sing about, some of the origins of the earth, about the origins of their people, about their traditions of their culture. And so that's a really important part of what Estonia is, and that's where I usually like to begin. This kind of cultural awakening happens in the 19th century, and it's really not until 1920 that they actually gain their own political independence. They take advantage really of the opportunity presented by the chaos in Tsarist Russia with the October Revolution, and in the aftermath of that, they gain their independence. They have to fight a war, they have to fight off Germans who are also trying to take advantage of the opportunity, but they end up signing a treaty with Lenin, granting them status as a nation and guaranteeing that the Soviet Union will not interfere with their sovereign status as a nation. And so they have independence, but it only lasts about 19 years before the Soviets moved in 1939. Kind of like where I like to begin, at least.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to that. And I guess during that period, whenever there's this transition, was there a lot of strife that was going on, higher levels of poverty and things of that nature?
So I would say that it was a cautiously optimistic sort of mood during that time period. So they were actually a relatively prosperous people.
Okay.
They had already developed a reputation for entrepreneurial. They had already developed these connections with the West, with Germany and Finland and Sweden and the UK. They were these trade partnerships. The negative side is, like a lot of countries in the 30s, they were drifting towards authoritarianism. And, it depends on who you read on this. I think there are probably some Estonian in the Whig tradition, maybe in Estonia, where they kind of talk about this period as like everything was wonderful. And there's others who look back and say, the president at the time, Konstantin Pats, he was actually drifting towards authoritarianism. Maybe he was actually outflanking more authoritarian parties. So it's hard to say whether he was necessarily the worst thing ever. But he had consolidated power, and was not particularly interested in entertaining competition for himself. So it was a cautiously maybe optimistic. It wasn't great, but it also wasn't the worst in the world. There's also some interesting things that they had done to develop, for example, some protections, really first of their kind protections of minorities, ethnic and religious minorities in the country, that really other countries in the West could learn from them during that time period.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you look back, and you mentioned Gortney and everything else, and the economic freedom of the world index, it's been so important, and I've written about it a lot as well. And you kind of see the improvements in economic freedom with Estonia over time. And I wonder kind of when did that really get started, though, of making those types of reforms to get to the place where it is today, which is near the top, or if not one of the most free countries in the world.
Yeah. Okay. So what you got to do is first, the huge shadow of socialism, is cast over Estonia for 4 decades. And so what happens in 1939 is the German foreign minister, Herr von Ribbentrop, lands in Moscow in September 1939. He's greeted by 6 giant swastika flags. I think we might have talked about this in our last discussion. The Soviets had just repurposed these from an anti-Nazi film studio. Now they were using them to greet their new allies. He's rushed to the Kremlin, where he meets with Stalin himself, and he finalizes the non-aggression pact. Now, what ended up happening is there were secret protocols of this pact that divided up Europe. And so under the auspices of these protocols, Germany invades Poland from the east and the Soviet Union from the west. And then after this victory, they move on Estonia. So they move 160,000 troops to the Soviets moved 160,000 troops to the Estonian border. There's only 16,000 Estonians on the troops on the other side. And they start saying, hey, we'd like a base here. We'd like the right to be able to have about, 35,000 troops stationed here, if you don't mind. And the Estonians kind of have to agree, as did the other Balts, the Latvians and the Lithuanians. Then after a few months, the Soviets accuse their accuse their allies of plotting against them. They don't offer any explanation, but they say, hey, you're plotting against us. We'd like you to form pro-Soviet cabinets, and then we'd like to have elections. So they hold fraudulent elections. How do we know they're fraudulent? When in some cases the turnout, we just had the Iowa caucuses, here in the States, there the turnout was 122% in some precincts. So that's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, wow.
And in other places, they actually released the results of the election before the election had even taken place. So that's also pretty remarkable. They had this power of being able to see the future. And with this, the Estonian legislature, with actually armed Red Army guards present with guns pointing at them, votes to petition to become part of the Soviet Union. That's kind of how it begins. It's this fraudulent elections, this fraudulent system. And so they are not, unlike Poland or Yugoslavia or the other countries, that they're not just in the Soviet orbit or as a puppet state. They're actually brought into the Soviet Union. They are subsumed as a state in the Soviet Union. So for the next, and we can talk in detail about this, but for the next 4 decades, that's the reality.
Okay.
So the real change, and this is where the story gets really remarkable, is what the Estonians managed to build once they resist and throw off socialism, and then manage to build this free society. And so there's a number of things I think that are important for why they were able to do this. But the truth is, Estonia was as far down the path to socialism as anybody, and they went as far down the path in the other direction towards a free society as almost any other country in the world.
Wow. Yeah, and I want to get to both of those, and I should mention I wanted to read off what the book title is: the Road to Freedom: Estonia's Rise from Soviet Vassal State to One of the Freest Nations on Earth. And that's what we're talking about and chronicling this change, these reforms that have taken place, kind of going in one direction to the other, where the government is basically controlling the means of production under socialism, and you have a situation where I'm sure those were trying times, and probably a lot of stories of telling from those trying times during those 40 years. Was this also a period of, a high number of deaths, of murders, and that sort of thing as well?
What happened is, the Soviets swept in and were in control for about a year. Then the Nazis turned, of course, on their allies, swept through. They were in control for a couple of years, and then the Soviets swept through again. Now, what's key here is that right after the Red Army arrives, in comes the predecessor to the KGB. It was called the NKVD, which, by the way, when that's transliterated into Estonian, it spells out coffin, the word for coffin.
Wow.
So that was really apropos, because what ended up happening is the secret police interview everybody over the age of 15, and they start identifying anybody who's not going to be a friend to the regime. Now, what's somebody who could be an enemy to the regime? If you're a stamp collector, if you speak Esperanto, if you have any kind of connection to somebody outside the country, they deemed you a potential enemy of the regime. Not to mention, of course, anybody who had any wealth or who showed any entrepreneurial, spirit. So what happens is they interview these people and they identify, right away about 10,000 people that they think that they need to deport. So they mostly concentrate on the urban areas. They load them up into cattle cars, on trains, and they send them to the so-called happier East. What really happened is families are separated. Men were typically sent to slave labor, and women and children were sent to Siberia to basically be in exile. And part of the strategy here then was to bring in Russians to take their place, because they felt that the Russians understood socialism better, understood the science of socialism better, and we're going to make Estonia more prosperous. So the Estonians had this joke that said, how many 5-year plans does it take before the prosperity of Estonia is reduced to the level of Russia? And the answer is actually it never would happen. Estonia was always one of the wealthiest Soviet republics, and it was also always one of the least content, because they just felt that the system very clearly was inferior to what they had already, started to develop as a fledgling market economy. So out of the bat, it starts with deportations. Right out of the bat, there are murders. There are people who are just outright killed. There's people who join the slave labor. It should be noted, by the way, about 16% of the entire labor force in the Soviet Union was slave labor. So people who were arrested, typically on trumped up charges, or, they'd be things like being an enemy of the people was one of their favorite, or being related to an enemy of the people. If you were over 15, you could be charged simply as being a relative of somebody who was in jail. And then they used them as slave labor to try to build Stalin's dream of a socialist economy. There was another wave of deportations that happened in the late 40s, in 1949, when they were trying to force Estonians onto collective farms. So here they had this idea, and it's really tragic because, at this point already they should have known collectivization in agriculture is a tragedy. 7 million people had already died as a result of starvation in Ukraine, but they still were, stubbornly obsessed with the idea of socializing agriculture. But the Estonians didn't want to do it. The farmers didn't want to join agricultural communes, and so they resisted. And in order to break their resistance, they again resorted to forced exportation. And so they, in the middle of the night, rounded up the rural population, and they shipped off about 14% of the farmers, put them in American-made Studebaker trucks, sent them east. And then, incentives work. Before this deportation, it had been under 10% of the Estonian farmers had wanted to join collectives. And then instantly, within a matter of days, you get about 70-80% compliance saying, okay, we're happy, we'll join your farms. So they joined the farms, and of course, socialism does what socialism does, and productivity collapsed. You had annual growth in agriculture of about 10% a year in the years before collectivization, and then you had a collapse of 10% a year in the years after collectivization.
Wow.
So it was an extraordinary hardship in terms of how people, lived. The other bizarre story, and this is one that's true for Estonia and not true for Poland, is they had this idea of collectivization within your home. So they actually, set limits on the size of your personal space. If the average person in a home had more than 9 square meters, and think about that, 9 square meters, that's 3 by 3.
Yeah, wow.
That's pretty tiny, right?
Yeah.
So if they had more than 9 square meters, then they would divide up your home. They would bring new people in and set up a collective household where everybody had to share the toilet, everybody had to share the kitchen, and then each family, you might have 3 generations, 6, 7 people cooped up in one bedroom. That was their new space, and it was their, part of their former house that they had built, maybe. And as part of this, they also brought in NKVD and then later KGB agents to be in the homes, particularly of people that they thought were politically untrustworthy. And the idea was to keep a close eye on them. It's extraordinary because you have these quotes from some people who actually were exiled to Siberia and said that living in a collective household was worse than exile.
Wow.
Because they were constantly being watched. Everything, there was no single place of their own, no place where they could be themselves. Whereas at least in exile, nobody really cared what you did or said because you were just out in the country, freezing, trying to survive, eating grass and digging holes in the ground for shelter, but nobody cared about you. Here, you're constantly being watched in your own home, and it was terrifying.
Yeah, that is terrifying. It sounds horrible, not only from the economic part of it, but your personal freedom given up in your own home of all places. Yeah. That's horrible. When you're digging into some of this and you read about all these experiences that happened and the history and everything else, it's kind of remarkable that they were able to overcome this, given where they had been and the generations and the number of people that were lost and the economics, the incentives weren't there for them to be entrepreneurial. When did the next shift happen? When did the next shock, if you will, that to allow for them to have the freedom that we know more about in Estonia today?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is there were certain traditions and certain resistance that sort of was going on throughout the whole period. One of them is singing. So they had this tradition of getting together, as I mentioned before, in these festivals. And the Soviets actually permitted this. They felt like they couldn't stop it, but they co-opted it. So they forced them to come together and sing love songs to Stalin and Lenin. And the Estonians would do it because they like to sing. And there was an unspoken bargain is, okay, when the festival is over, they would then sing their traditional Estonian songs. And the Soviets would try to drown them out, or they would try to stop it, but kind of half-heartedly.
Wow.
And so the Estonians managed to kind of keep this illegal activity. And part of it is that, you got 20,000, 30,000 people, you got a Taylor Swift size concert venue, and sometimes they were larger than that. And you can't stop people from singing if they want to. So that's one form of resistance. Another fascinating form of resistance, by the way, was what were called the Forest Brothers. So for most of the world, of course, World War II ended in 1945. In Estonia, it didn't end then. Same thing, Latvia and Lithuania. There in the Baltic states, people took to the forest and they continued to bear arms resisting the Soviet occupation. The Estonians actually were the first of the Baltic states to have what they called themselves Forest Brothers. They were also the last Estonian Forest Brother died in 1978, still, fighting World War II against the Soviets. So you had this tradition of resistance, but what really got things going is 1987, what's known as the Phosphate Spring. We often hear this idea that, environmental degradation is due to the profit motive. If you just take a tour of what was happening in Eastern Europe and under the Soviet Union and the satellite states, I think you'll be disabused of that notion.
Yeah.
So the Soviet record on the environment was absolutely atrocious. And, they had these giant piles of often radioactive phosphate that were choking, that they were just sitting around in the countryside and then choking the water supply. They had the worst air, in all of Europe. Most of the water supply was poisoned. And so in 1987, the Soviets wanted to dig for more phosphate. Now, if it had been put up to the profit motive, there's no question about it. They would have left the phosphate in the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It was generally pretty mineral poor. It wasn't worth the effort to get it out. But they're not guided by a system of profit and loss. Instead, they're just guided by trying to get the plan. And so to them, it looked like a good idea, especially because it meant that they could bring more Russians in. So what was remarkable is the Estonians resisted it. And they were able to, one, because it was glasnost, and this was a period of openness that Gorbachev was allowing. And two, because it was the environment. And even in the Soviet Union, that's something that you could protest around because it was kind of a technical issue. It wasn't necessarily a political issue. But that taught the Estonians that they could resist and they could actually win.
Wow.
So the Soviets actually backed down on their new phosphate mining. Then they started openly talking, holding public rallies around the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Mm-hmm. So this is something you're not allowed to talk about, and yet they talked about it. And so they held some rallies around that. This then turned into some spontaneous resistance on the Song Festival grounds. You had 100,000 people show up in the Song Festival grounds and start singing spontaneously, and they start singing in the Estonian tongue, Estonian resistance songs, Estonian celebrations of the Estonian culture. And some of these songs are quite explicit as rejections of the Russian ruble and the Russian system as well. So then you get that. Then you have this remarkable, extremely well-staged event. This is like, again, it's not spontaneous in this case. This is like very well-organized social resistance called the Baltic Way. And on the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, 2 million people gather from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all the way through the Baltic states in a 670-kilometer human chain, holding hands.
Wow.
And just commemorating the infamous day of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And so these kind of events, at one point in the Song Festival grounds, they had 300,000 people. So this is a third of the country showed up in a single place to protest. So you start to have this organized resistance. The Soviets, they had been willing to let Poland and other satellite states go because they weren't part of the Soviet Union. But even Gorbachev, he'd already received the Nobel Peace Prize, and yet his army is still firing on people in the Baltic states who are trying to resist in Latvia. What we are doing here is trying to actually dissolve the Soviet Union. And that's something that Gorbachev didn't want to countenance.
Yeah.
For all the openness, for all the change, that's something that he couldn't accept. And he also couldn't accept open rejection of socialism.
Wow.
And so really, their real opportunity didn't happen until 1991 in the chaos of the failed coup against Gorbachev when they actually declared their independence.
Wow. It's also quite remarkable given the swell from the bottom up. Is that there wasn't some top-down approach or an overthrow or something along those lines. It really was. I like this vision of seeing all these people just singing and coming together and clasping hands as a way to overcome this socialism and all the other things that they've went through over the last 40 years. To say, you know what, enough is enough. We've got to turn into a different direction. And now when we think about Estonia, before we went on to record, one of the things that I like a lot about it is their tax structure and flat taxes and things of that nature. They're usually ranked around the top, if not the top in the world by the Tax Foundation and others that are out there. What are some of the other things getting to today, as we're kind of closing up some here, that really sets Estonia apart to have more flourishing and less prosperity and to let people prosper?
Yeah. I think the tax system is a good place to start because it is innovative. It's the world's first flat tax. And if you look at the rate, you'd think, oh, this is pretty cool. It's a 20% rate when the average OECD tax rate is 42%. So that, it's less than half. But it's actually even more remarkable than that in how clever it's set up. And it's also actually relatively simple. So what they did is they apply this 20% rate. It's both to personal income as well as corporate income, but it's only distributed profits. Unlike corporate tax in the United States, where if the firm earns income, whether it distributes it to shareholders or not, they still have to pay the tax. So then once it's distributed to shareholders, they end up having to pay it through their personal income tax. By the way, it's also probably taxed through property and through sales. Yeah. And, by the time you get it, it's been taxed 3-4 times. That's not the way in Estonia. In Estonia, the only time the corporate income tax of 20% is ever applied is when the company actually distributes the income to two people, two shareholders. So that's pretty remarkable. And it ended up being, an extremely efficient tax system. And really, it's also part of the story of this high compliance and low corruption that Estonia set. Right from the bat, you just create a simple tax that's easy to comply with, and it turns out people are willing to comply with it, and it's able to raise a fair amount of revenue. So you've got that. Another remarkable story is they unilaterally, and I have to emphasize this and underline it, they unilaterally eliminated all barriers to trade. In the modern era, a country unilaterally eliminating all barriers to trade, it's almost unheard of. In fact, when they went to then negotiate to go into the EU and to form the WTO, they actually had to add a couple tariffs back just to have something to negotiate over. It's really ridiculous. And that ended up being important because it's essentially a down payment on other types of reforms. So if you suddenly expose your companies to that level of competition, global competition, any company in the world, you better make sure that your companies are not hamstrung by high taxes and burdensome regulations. Make sure that they're relatively competitive. And so it was a really nice down payment on further reforms. Their privatization, other countries, Germany, West Germany, really extolled their privatization plan and, went around the world talking about it like it was the best in the world. It had a lot of problems, and it took a long time, and it was actually quite inefficient. There was quite a few accusations of corruption. Estonia did it much cleaner. First of all, they just prioritized previous ownership. There's one story of, a widow who went into her backyard, dug up a tin, and found in that tin a piece of paper that she and her husband had put there 4 decades earlier that was the deed to their commercial property. They took it down to the local government and they said, here's the deed to our property. And the local government said, yes, it sure is. Congratulations, you own it again. And that prioritizing previous ownership, any evidence that you owned it, they did a sort of clever version of voucher privatization where the managers and the workers were given pieces of paper that said that they owned the businesses in which they had been working. The business had previously been owned by the people. Now it was owned by the people who actually worked there and understood the business and could operate it. They had a lot of help from foreigners, especially the Finns. They managed to set up the world's first e-government where it was the only government in the world where you could vote online, you could register a business online, you could pay your taxes online, do everything online. Again, it was reinforced through mechanisms that encouraged it. So there was actually a law that said it's illegal for the government to ask the same person the same question twice in their lifetime.
Wow.
So this sort of, self-reinforces. So everything from deregulation, privatization, kept spending under control. Spending was less than revenue, balanced their budget, introduced a currency board, and overnight adopted a hard currency. 1,000% inflation just disappeared. Really remarkable. And a lot of this does go to Mart Laar, who was the first elected prime minister. He was only 32 years old when he took office. He had a cabinet full of 20 and 30-year-olds. His only exposure to economics was this book by Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom. He had heard about this infamous Western economist who was just the devil, according to the propaganda. And so he thought, if the Soviet this happened so much in Soviet occupation of Estonia. If the Soviets say this guy's so bad, I better read him. He might be good. And sure enough, he was good. And he took a lot of ideas straight out of that book.
Wow.
And he's funny about it. He's a very unassuming guy. And he'll say, I wasn't an economist. I just assumed this was what all economics was. He didn't quite realize he was implementing something so radical. And it ended up working.
Wow.
It's pretty extraordinary.
That really is extraordinary. When you look around the world and some of these other countries, in particular here in Argentina, or there in Argentina recently with Javier Milei, do you see some overlap between what he's doing there compared to Estonia, or is that just too far removed?
I don't know. I'm not an expert on Argentina, so I don't know. But I do get this question a lot. I mean, I think the one thing that's important here is the idea of leadership. And this is, Pete likes to say this, it seems weird for us economists to talk about this because you're usually emphasizing, rules, institutions, structure. It doesn't matter who the people are. But sometimes for reform, it really does matter who the people are. And, in order to get a difficult reform, and you have to emphasize this is difficult, right? As Pete says in one of his books, at the end of the Soviet Union, at the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the average person woke up in the wrong city, went to work in the wrong job, doing the wrong thing, and they'd done it for decades.
Yeah.
So that's like all they know. So of course, in that system, if you're going to try to actually build things that consumers are going to be voluntarily willing to purchase, there's a lot of pain that has to go on. If all you know how to do is make useless trinkets that the Soviet state thinks that you should make, that's a lot of work to try to kind of change the mindsets. And that's where leadership does matter. And so, Javier Milei being, this charismatic leader who clearly does understand something about economics, I do think I see some similarities there. There's a lot of other differences. Right?
Yeah, sure. I wonder, as we're really wrapping up here, last couple of minutes, I wonder, with the direction that America, just bringing it home a little bit here, there's been a direction towards less free trade, more government spending, higher amounts of debt, potentially higher taxes, not even potentially, but there are been higher taxes here recently, higher inflation has been around and stuff like that. Are there lessons that we should be learning from these movements toward more free market capitalism, which seems like we're moving away from, unfortunately, Matt? What are some of the lessons that we could be learning here in America?
Yeah. So, I think one simple lesson, and this is, you see this in Orwell, you see this in Hayek's Road to Serfdom. People have been trying to make this lesson for a while, but it's still true, is the economic freedom and civil freedom are intimately connected. You can't think that you can stamp out one and centrally control an economy and still somehow manage to preserve personal freedoms. It's impossible. And, to put it in stark terms, think about Eric Garner, who lost his life for a commercial transaction. This kid was trying to sell loose cigarettes on the streets of New York. He's trying to engage in voluntary exchange, and that's illegal. And so whenever you make something illegal, you do have the possibility that the police will use force in trying to enforce that. I think that's one lesson, is we can't assume that we are immune from this, near universal rule that economic freedom and civil freedom are intimately, connected. You do need leadership and you need speed. So that was one thing that there wasn't actually a lot of debate about what needed to be done in the former Soviet states. Everybody agreed they needed to, balance their budgets, reduce spending, open up for competition, have better monetary policy, lower taxes, all of that. There was just a debate about how fast it should happen. And that's where, somebody like Martin Lahr was pretty innovative. He adopted the capitalistic phrase, just do it. And he said, when something needs being done, there's no use in just standing there trembling. It's going to be difficult. It's never going to have, as much political momentum as it has in the beginning. So just do it. And so I think that is part of the lesson there too.
Yeah. Awesome. Just do it. You can remember that one quite often. It's great. I hope everyone goes and checks out this book, The Road to Freedom, Estonia's Rise from Soviet Vassal State to One of the Freest Nations on Earth. Go check that out. Go check out the website as well. I'll put this on the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com. And also check out your work on Poland, which is also great, with Peter Boettke, one of my favorite economists. It's a great guy overall. And I hope you continue to do this work, Matt. It's really providing and shedding a lot of light on what's happened in the past, to hopefully not repeat those things, but also know how to do for the future to let people prosper. And again, God bless you and your family, Matt. And I hope that you continue to prosper every day.
Thanks so much, Vance. I really appreciate it. It's always great to see you.
Yeah, same with you, Matt. And, for the audience, I hope you enjoyed this. Please go and give us a 5-star rating and rate and review and share it with all your friends and family. And until next time, let people prosper.